As the traveler from Naroda returned home, the great windflowers of his planet bowed gently to greet him. He stepped out of his slow-moving ship, more like a giant floating hammock than a vehicle, and breathed in the sweet, thick air that only existed here. It smelled like old parchment and ripe peaches. Time in Naroda wasn't measured, it was felt. Seasons drifted like dreams, overlapping like watercolor on damp paper. The stars moved across the sky with the pace of a heartbeat during meditation. The traveler, whose name was Unel, went back to his village, a round cluster of homes made from woven vines and moon clay. They pulsed slightly at night, like sleeping creatures. Inside, the walls welcomed him with a soft sigh. They had missed the weight of his voice. That evening, as twilight stretched its golden fingers across the sky, Unel visited the Listening Grove, a quiet place where ancient trees recorded thoughts that were never spoken aloud. People came there not to talk, but to think. The trees listened and remembered. Unel sat under a tree named Elna, the oldest of them all. He placed his hand on her trunk and let her feel what he had seen on Earth: the rush, the urgency, the ticking, clicking, buzzing, flashing noise of it all. Elna responded not in words, but in a warmth that spread through his arm and into his chest, a feeling of reassurance. "You are home now," she seemed to say. "Here, there is no need to hurry. Even dreams walk here." The sky turned indigo. Tiny floating lights, like sleepy stars, rose from the grass. Children gathered them in jars not to trap them, but to whisper wishes, slowly, respectfully, before setting them free. Unel walked slowly to his own home, where his grandmother, Yesie, was preparing dream leaves for tea. She handed him a cup with both hands, bowing slightly, the Narodan way of offering gratitude, not just a drink. They sat together in silence, sipping. And after a long while, Yesie spoke. "You went to the world of quick feet and short breaths," she said, eyes half closed. "Did it tire you?" "Yes," said Unel, "but it also made me remember why we live like this." "Tell me," she said, settling deeper into her pillow chair. And Unel began to speak of time not as something lost or counted, but as something grown, like a garden. He spoke slowly, so slowly that even the shadows on the wall listened without moving. And the night listened too. Unel told Yesie how on Earth the people ran through their days as if time were escaping from beneath their feet. Clocks barked at them like impatient dogs, phones blinked endlessly, and even sleep felt rushed, a duty rather than a comfort. Yesie nodded gently, running her fingers along the rim of her cup. "They are loud because they fear silence," she whispered. Outside, the wind began its nightly ritual, brushing through the hanging chimes made of stone shells, each tone a lullaby composed not by anyone in particular, but by time itself. Unel leaned back, and his gaze drifted to the window where the moons of Naroda, there were 3, began their slow arc across the sky. Each moon moved at its own pace, a celestial dance that had no beginning or end. One moon always glowed with a soft blue hue, the second shimmered silver like dust, and the third appeared only when someone whispered a secret aloud. "Did you speak to anyone?" Yesie asked, her voice as light as breath. "I did, but they don't hear like we do. Their listening is short. They wait only for a chance to speak." Yesie smiled, a slow upward curve of understanding. "Listening without waiting is one of the oldest arts we know." Unel didn't reply. He didn't need to. The fire in the center of the room was not for heat, but for memory. It flickered with images, moments from the day or even from many days ago. A picture of a child petting a moss animal. A vine growing across a fence. A quiet moment of 2 hands brushing while reaching for the same fruit. These were the things Narodans remembered, not achievements, but feelings. Isia stood slowly and placed her empty cup on a shelf carved into the wall. "Will you visit the dream garden tonight?" "I think I must," Unel said. "I brought too much waking world back with me." She nodded, touching his shoulder. "Then go gently." So Unel walked through the violet-lit night, following a path of soft stones that hummed when stepped on, a sound only the sleepy could hear. He reached the dream garden, a vast open space where thoughts bloomed into flowers if you stayed still long enough. There, he lay in the moss, eyes open to the sky, and let his mind unravel like a quiet ribbon in the wind. And in that space, where no clocks ticked and no footsteps echoed, Unel let go of the world's haste. He dreamed not of doing, but of being. He dreamed slowly. He dreamed wide. He dreamed as Narodans do. Far above him, the third moon flickered into view, a soft, elusive presence that only revealed itself when someone had laid their burdens down. It shimmered like a sigh exhaled by the stars. The dream garden responded to Unel's stillness. Around him, blossoms opened, translucent petals that reflected memories not only from his own life but from the shared memory of Naroda. A flower unfolded showing the image of a child learning to whistle. Another glowed faintly with the memory of two friends laughing under the rain tree during a silent festival. Each flower was a gentle story, and none of them needed words. In Naroda, dreams were not escapes, but slow returns to self, to earth, to quiet. As Unel lay there, the garden began to hum, not a sound exactly, but a deep, peaceful vibration that echoed through his ribs. He wasn't asleep yet, but he wasn't quite awake either. He was resting in between, as the Narodans said, the sacred space where healing happens. Elsewhere in the village, others were entering this same space. Children curled in crescent-shaped beds whispered to their walls, offering soft gratitude. Elders soaked their feet in warm sky water, watching memory birds pass like thoughts overhead. And above it all, the moons continued their silent spiral. Hours passed, or perhaps moments, time didn't matter. Unel's mind softened. Even his thoughts began to walk slower. They wandered, meandered, drifted like fog over still water. Eventually, the garden began to dim, not as a signal to leave, but as a quiet embrace, as if to say, "You are safe here." Unel rose slowly. He walked back to his village through the winding path of sighing stones, past the listening trees and dreaming houses. Every window glowed with soft, pulsing light, the rhythm of those inside, breathing gently, wrapped in dreams. He entered his home and laid down on his moss bed, pressing his cheek to the warm earth wall. The house hummed softly, remembering him. Outside, the chimes whispered. The moons watched. The night deepened. And Unel finally slept, not to escape, not to reset, but to return fully to the quiet that was always waiting. While Unel slept, the house gently adjusted its temperature to match the rhythm of his breath. It had known his sleep since childhood, every pattern, every pause. In Naroda, homes were not just shelters, they were companions, listeners, and keepers of silent promises. As his dreams unfolded, they did not rush. They came slowly, one by one, like leaves falling into a still pond. First came the dream of the sky trader, a gentle old man who floated from village to village in a balloon stitched from old lullabies. He never spoke, only handed out dreams wrapped in soft fabric. Unel accepted his offering, unwrapped it, and found himself standing on the edge of a silver lake that reflected not the sky, but the feeling of being truly understood. Next came the dream of the lost animal, a creature with velvet fur and clockwork eyes, who had forgotten its name. Unel walked beside it through silent dunes, neither of them speaking. But when the animal laid down and rested its head against his leg, it sighed, a long, contented sound, and remembered. Unel named it now. The animal purred in agreement. Back in the waking world, though it wasn't really waking yet, a slow rain began to fall over Naroda. Rain here did not start or stop. It arrived and lingered like an old friend who didn't need to knock. The droplets were large and soft, and they carried tiny lights inside them, faint, gentle illuminations of other people's dreams. Each drop that landed on a rooftop added to the communal memory, a shared dream library, accessible not through books, but through deep sleep and quiet feeling. The rain whispered on Unel's roof. In his dream, he stood at the edge of a great field where thousands of Narodans slept side by side, each glowing softly with their own dreamlight. Above them, the moons turned like thoughts in a slow mind. The stars watched, curious, quiet. A voice, perhaps his own, spoke to him from the sky. You've remembered what the world forgot. That stillness is a kind of music. And then, nothing, just the soft hum of being. Unel slept deeper, and the night, satisfied, held him in its arms. As the night deepened, the entire village of Naroda seemed to exhale in unison. Not from exhaustion, Narodans rarely tired, but from a kind of peace that came only when everything in the world aligned with rest. Unel's dream slipped into its third shape, the most delicate of all, the dream of time itself. He stood before a river that didn't flow forward or back. It moved in slow spirals, gently folding into itself, like a stream lost in thought. On its banks sat a being made of fog and woven light. It had no face, but when it turned toward him, Unel felt seen by every version of himself. Young, old, joyful, uncertain. Time didn't speak in words. It radiated understanding. Unel sat beside it, and for a long while, perhaps centuries, perhaps seconds, they simply watched the river of unhurried moments drift by. Sometimes it showed memories, sometimes futures, but most often it showed moments in between. A hand resting on bark, an eye blinking slowly toward a candle, the quiet smile after a thought dissolves. You've come far, time finally said, not with a mouth, but with the softness of falling ash. Yes, Unel whispered, but I think I was always coming here. Time nodded, if fog can nod. Then you're ready to return. The dream began to dim again, not like sleep ending, but like breath drawing inward, preparing for another gentle exhale. And Unel opened his eyes. He was back in his room, the roof humming softly above, the rain still falling with its silver light. The scent of dream leaves lingered in the air. He lay still for a while, not because he was tired, but because movement didn't feel necessary. He sat up, stretched like a tree waking after winter, and stepped to the doorway. The village was soaked in a glowing hush. Others were beginning to stir, blinking the night from their eyes, wrapped in shawls of sleep and silence. They didn't speak yet, not until the sky turned rose-colored and the chimes gave their first morning note, a tone that meant, "You may speak now if you wish, but you don't have to." Unel looked up at the third moon. It was still there, still watching. He whispered, "Thank you," not knowing to whom, but certain the message would arrive. Then he smiled, a slow smile, a Narodan smile, And he began his day the way his people always had, not with urgency, not with plans, but with presence. And the world, as always, answered with stillness. As the light gently unfolded over the hills of Naroda, a low melodic sound drifted through the village. Not a bell, but the morning tone of the air harps, instruments strung between tall, whispering trees. They played only when the wind was calm and kind, shaping notes not to rouse, but to invite one into the day. Unel stood at his doorway, bare feet touching the soft, woven moss of the path. He watched as neighbors emerged, one by one, their movements unhurried, wrapped in shawls made of sleep-colored thread. No one rushed. No one spoke more than a nod or a smile. Today was a day of observing, a day set aside not for work or talk, but for the art of quiet watching. In Naroda, this was a tradition older than their stories, a sacred day when one practiced not doing so deeply, it became its own form of knowing. Unel walked slowly to the Hill of Breaths, a high place above the village where one could see both the sea of listening and the forest of forgotten paths. Along the way, he passed a child crouched beside a snail, quietly following its trail with her fingertip. An elder sat beside a window, watching the wind move a single feather across the floor. At the hill's crest, Unel sat and let his breath match the rhythm of the wind. Below, the sea moved like sleeping lungs. No waves, just slow pulses of silver and blue, as if the ocean itself had learned the Narodan way. Time passed, or it didn't. In Naroda, it was the same. Around midday or something like it, a sound rose from the valley. The one tone, sung not by an instrument or voice, but by the combined harmonics of nature, wind, stone, and memory. It happened only once every many rotations, and only on days when the people were most quiet. Unel closed his eyes. The sound wasn't heard so much as felt. It moved through his ribs, settled in his chest, and resonated in a place he didn't have a name for. Around the village, others heard it too. Children paused, birds stilled, even the moss stopped growing for a breath. It was the sound of harmony between all things, of life lived without noise, without force, without rush. Said, "You are in the right place. You are the right pace." And then it was gone. Unel stood, heart full of silence, and began his walk back. Evening would soon arrive, not suddenly but slowly as always. Shadows would lengthen like arms stretching after sleep, and stars would blink awake with soft patience. He would return home, drink tea, speak little, sleep deeply, and tomorrow would come, not like a storm, but like a feather landing on the palm of an open hand. That evening, as the stars gently revealed themselves one by one, never all at once, never urgently, Unel returned to his home. The air smelled of cool stone and evening blossoms, a scent Narodans called night's first memory. Inside, his house had prepared for his return. The walls were warm, the light dimmed to a soft amber glow. A small bowl of steamed hushberries waited for him, fruit known not for their taste, but for the calming hum they released when warmed. Eating them was less about flavor and more about presence. As Unel chewed slowly, the faint vibrations of the berries soothed his chest, like a cat sleeping against his heart. He did not speak. He did not need to. Words in Naroda were used sparingly, not because silence was emptiness, but because it was full. Later, as the moons reached their highest arc, he walked to the pavilion of once more, a circular open-air space in the center of the village. On nights like this, those who had heard the one tone would gather, not to talk about it. That would be too blunt, but simply to share its echo in silence. People came with soft instruments, with tapestries to weave under starlight, with bowls of moonglow water in which they would float flower petals, each representing a feeling too tender to name. Unel brought nothing. He brought himself, and that was enough. He sat among them. Friends, strangers, elders, children, all arranged in quiet shapes, like thoughts sitting together. A child crawled into his lap, leaned her head against his chest, and fell asleep to the sound of his breathing. Around them, stories were not told but shown, through movements, through textures, through the gentle rhythm of togetherness. In the center of the pavilion stood the echo stone, an ancient shard that had been there before any Narodan could remember. It hummed softly, reflecting the shared stillness of the gathering. It did not amplify sound, it amplified peace. And as the hours passed, slow and generous, a feeling settled over the people of Naroda like a thick, warm blanket. This is what it means to be, not to rush, not to change, not to chase, but simply to be. And beneath the silver eyes of 3 moons, Unel exhaled that truth, letting it leave his body like mist, to be caught by the night and carried across the village like a lullaby for those still half awake. As the night deepened, something subtle began to unfold in the air, a soft shifting, as though the sky itself were drawing closer, listening more attentively. In Naroda, this moment had a name: Sivlin, or the hour when dreams lean forward. It was a time known only to those who stayed awake through the first layer of sleep, a thin veil between waking and the dream field. Most Narodans, especially elders and dream gatherers, cherished Sivlin not for what happened, but for what didn't. Unel remained seated in the pavilion of once more, now surrounded by sleeping villagers curled like commas in a silent poem. He didn't feel tired, not in the way Earth had taught him to measure tiredness. Instead, he felt settled, as if time had made a nest inside him and decided to stay. Then, gently, a change in the wind. From the far side of the pavilion, an old woman approached, not Isiye, but someone older still, her steps like breaths, her hair the color of moon ash. Her name was Tavalen, and some said she had once dreamed the weather into being. She did not sit. She stood behind the echo stone, placed her palm on it, and closed her eyes. And for the first time that evening, words were spoken. Very softly. The dream you left behind is still waiting. The words rang not like sound, but like ripples inside the chest. Unel understood. He stood up, bowed slightly, the way one bows not from politeness, but from recognition, and walked away from the circle back into the quiet paths of the village. He followed no trail, only a feeling, like being pulled by a thread made of memory and light. He passed silent lanterns that burned not with fire, but with reflections of nearby dreams. One showed a young Narodan teaching a vine to sing. Another held the image of 2 hands weaving wind into thread. Finally, Unel arrived at the room of the unfinished dream, a small round chamber built for those who needed to complete something they hadn't yet remembered how to finish. He stepped inside. No candles, no furnishings, only air that hummed with gentle potential. He sat in the center, and he waited, not for sleep, not for answers, but for something even rarer. Readiness. Outside, the third moon watched not for the ending of a story, but for the deep silence that comes before something beautiful begins again. Unel sat in the room of the unfinished dream with his eyes closed, though it didn't matter. The room had no light, no dark, only a soft weightlessness, like being held inside a breath that never needed to end. Time here did not pass. It unfolded, slowly, like petals blooming under moonlight. He waited not with expectation, but with stillness, the way Narodans had been taught for generations. In this room, waiting was not passive. It was an act of quiet trust. And then, without sound, without light, the unfinished dream returned. It arrived like a warmth behind the ribs, a shape just beyond memory. He saw himself, younger, perhaps walking a narrow path through a forest that never ended. Not lost, just looking, but for what he had never known. Now he did. He had been searching not for a place, or a person, or a truth. He had been looking for a way to stay still. In that moment, the dream completed itself, not with revelation, but with acceptance. The path didn't need to end. The forest didn't need to open. The journey was the stillness, and he had carried it with him all along. The air in the room shifted ever so slightly, like the exhale after a long-held breath. Unel opened his eyes. The room welcomed him back, not by changing, but by becoming even more itself. The silence deepened in a way that felt full, not empty. And in that fullness, he rose to his feet, lighter somehow, as if having left something behind, or perhaps finally integrated it. Outside, Naroda still slept, though some began to stir as the edge of dawn glowed like slow honey on the horizon. He stepped into the early morning air. The village rooftops glistened with the last traces of night rain. Birds, not loud, not hurried, sang notes spaced so far apart you could breathe between them. Somewhere, a baker stirred his dough with closed eyes. A child turned in sleep, murmuring a dream to her pillow. Unel walked slowly to the central square. Tavalen was there, seated on the ground, weaving star thread into a net, not to catch anything, but to let the morning light land softly. She did not look at him, but she smiled. A knowing smile. Unel sat beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The dream was finished. But the morning was just beginning. The morning in Naroda did not rise, it emerged, like mist curling upward from warm stones. It was not announced by alarm or urgency, but by a shifting color. The sky turned the softest rose, then the color of candle wax, then a gold so quiet it could only be seen with closed eyes. Unel sat beside Tavalen as she wove her star thread, each motion slow and intentional. The net she made was not meant to trap, but to hold, a shape of patience, an offering of structure to things that had none. After a while, other villagers began to join them in the square. Not out of obligation. They simply arrived. One by one, like notes in a slow song. A boy brought a pot of water. An elder placed 2 stones at the center of the gathering, one warm, one cool. A woman in a cloak of wind-colored fabric hummed a tune older than memory. They were preparing for the morning pause, a Narodan ritual performed after every day of observing. Not a celebration, not a meeting, just a shared stillness. When the sun finally lifted itself above the low mountains, it touched every surface in Naroda with light that did not glare, it listened. And then, almost invisibly, the air thickened with presence. The villagers placed their hands on the ground. They closed their eyes, and for 7 heartbeats, nothing moved. In Naroda, this moment was sacred. It was the acknowledgement of existence, not of achievement, not of plans, just a being. Unel felt the heartbeat of the earth through his palms. He felt the sleep still lingering in the air. He felt the quiet presence of others not as distractions but as soft confirmations of life beside life. And when the 7 beats passed, the village opened its eyes. Nothing needed to be said. Their silence had already spoken. People began to rise, returning to the gentle rhythms of their lives, some to their gardens, some to their tools, some simply to walking in spirals through the tall grass. Unel did not rise. He stayed seated, watching the light move across the surface of the dew water, watching how the star-thread net now shimmered with the colors of morning, watching the way a bird landed not far from him, looked into his eyes, and blinked once slowly before flying off with no urgency. He smiled, a Narodan smile, the kind that carries whole seasons in it. And when he finally stood, he whispered not to the air, but through it, letting the words fall like petals. "I am here." And Naroda, all around him, whispered back, "We know." The day unfolded gently, like a blanket being drawn across a sleeping child. Unel walked slowly along the edge of the village, where fields of listening grass swayed in the wind. These tall, slender blades weren't known for their color or fragrance, but for the way they responded to footsteps, not with rustling, but with a faint chime that matched the walker's mood. Today, as Unel passed through them, the grass gave off a low, harmonious tone. Not sad, not joyful, but full. A tone of wholeness, of completion. The sound of someone who had returned home not just in space, but in spirit. He arrived at the House of Cycles, a rounded structure made of driftwood and cloudstone, where Narodans brought thoughts too large to keep, not to confess, not to explain, but to share with time. Inside, the walls were covered in spiral carvings, etched slowly over generations by anyone who had lived through something worth remembering in silence. There were no dates, no names, just lines and curves that wound inward and outward, echoing the breath of those who had made them. Unel picked up a small stone tool, smooth with age, and began his own spiral. He didn't rush. Each movement followed his breath. A curve for the dream unfinished. A dip for the dream found. A long, slow arc for the room that held him as he waited. And finally, a small loop, not an end, but a gesture of return, of readiness to begin the cycle again, differently, gently. When he was done, he sat back and looked at his mark among thousands of others. There was no pride, no performance, only participation. He had added to something larger than himself, and that was enough. Outside, the day continued its quiet bloom. In the distance, a group of children released float thoughts, tiny glowing seeds that carried emotions into the sky. One glowed warm with forgiveness. Another shimmered with curiosity. A third, the faintest lavender, pulsed slowly with the feeling of letting go. Unel watched as they rose into the air, drifting toward the horizon where the sky met the memory sea. And he whispered, not to them, but for himself, may I always walk slow enough to hear my own heart. And as if in reply, the listening grass behind him gave a single low chime, a note of agreement, of understanding, of peace. As the sun reached its highest, casting soft amber shadows across Naroda, the world did not grow busier. It grew slower, as if the very light were leaning into the ground, asking it to rest a little more deeply. Unel wandered to the edge of the memory shore, where the land met the sea of listening. Here, waves didn't crash. They arrived, as quiet as breath. Every Narodan knew that this sea held the echoes of every thought never spoken aloud. Things too delicate for language, too vast for even dreams. There were others there, scattered across the smooth stones. Some sketched shapes in the sand with their fingers. Others simply stared at the horizon, eyes half-lidded, lost in gentle reverie. Unel sat where the water just touched his toes. It was cool, but not cold, the kind of cool that made you feel awake without needing to do anything. He closed his eyes and listened, not for waves, but for stories, because in Naroda the sea sometimes told them, and today it did. A soft voice rose, not through sound but through sensation, a kind of slow warmth that began in the bones and moved outward. Once there was a people who ran. They ran so fast they forgot where they were going. They ran until their dreams couldn't keep up. And then they arrived, not at a place but at a stillness. And that stillness taught them how to live again. Unel felt the story settle into him like a stone sinking gently into water. He didn't question its meaning. In Naroda, understanding was not urgent. It would blossom later when it was ready. As he sat, a child approached him, no more than 6 or 7, wrapped in a shawl of cloud-colored thread. She held out a small shell, cupped in both hands. "It heard your thoughts," she said softly. Unel took it gently and pressed it to his ear. Inside, there was no sound, only a feeling of being seen without being looked at. He nodded, and the child smiled in that Narodan way, not as a greeting or a farewell, but as a gentle invitation to remain. She skipped back to her family, who were now laying out a slow lunch, a meal eaten not in courses, but in intervals, with long pauses between bites to let the food speak. Unel remained by the shore until the sun began its slow descent. He did not count the hours. He simply received them. And as the tide rose to wash the marks from the sand, he whispered a word Narodans used only at the end of truly full moments. "Sealant." It meant, you may forget this, but you won't lose it. And the sea, wise and patient, carried his word into the great hush of the horizon. As the sun dipped lower, shadows in Naroda began to stretch like slow dancers, reaching toward the horizon in fluid, patient movements. The light softened into what the Narodans called the golden listen, the moment each evening when everything, even the air, seemed to pause to remember itself. Unel rose from the memory shore, the shell still warm in his hand. He did not carry it home. In Naroda, things found were always meant to be left again for someone else to discover. So he placed it gently on a flat stone by the path, whispering to it, "Wait for the next heart." The path to the village shimmered slightly in the waning light. As he walked, he passed the telling trees, ancient, thick-trunked beings whose bark rippled like fabric in the wind. People hung small stories on them, written not with ink but with feeling strips, woven threads that changed color based on the mood they held. Unel paused before one such story. It was a strip the color of cooled tea, the tone of calm after sorrow. He ran his fingers along it, and the feeling entered him gently. I thought I would never stop running. Then I sat down, and the world came closer. He smiled. The village was beginning to glow now. Not from lanterns, but from memory lights, floating orbs that drifted slowly over rooftops. Each one was filled with the warmth of a remembered kindness. No one knew where they came from. They just appeared every evening wherever they were needed most. Unel's home glowed softly as he approached. The door opened on its own, not from magic, but from knowing. In Naroda, homes learned the rhythm of their dwellers. They listened. They remembered. Inside, the floor was warm, and a small tray of rest fruit waited. The walls exhaled a low, slow tone, the house's way of saying, "You are safe. Be slow." He sat by the low window and watched as the third moon began to rise. It flickered at first like a dream testing its shape, and then settled into the sky with deep, confident stillness. He didn't feel the need to speak, even to himself, even inside. Instead, he closed his eyes and leaned back, not to sleep, but to drift in the space Narodans called Beluma, the soft distance between thought and sleep, where the soul walks alone and the world watches kindly. There in the quiet, in the fading gold, in the deepening blue, Unel simply was. And nothing more was needed. Night in Naroda never fell. It arrived. Slowly, softly, like a silk curtain drawn by unseen hands. Stars didn't pierce the sky, they emerged from it, one after another, as if waking from their own slumber. The air took on the gentle texture of velvet. Every breeze felt like a whisper spoken through folded cloth. Unel lay on his moss bed, not sleeping yet, simply present in the unfolding of night. The walls of his home darkened with him, their glow easing into a color Narodans called Norv, the shade of trust before dreams. From outside came the sound of the night flutes, played by the wind through hollow reeds planted at the village's edge. The notes weren't played by anyone's hands. They came and went with the breeze, a wild lullaby shaped by the breath of the world itself. Unel turned to his side, facing the small circular window above his bed, where he could see the threaded constellation, a line of stars said to be the stitching that holds the sky together. When a Narodan made peace with something in their heart, one more thread in that star line glowed brighter. Tonight, it shimmered more than usual. And then, just as his thoughts began to loosen and float, there came a knock. Soft, like rain on dried leaves. Unel rose without worry. In Naroda, no one knocked unless the moment was worthy of quiet. At the door stood Enna, the village's dream scribe, a slender figure wrapped in robes that changed color with her mood. Tonight, they were the color of cooling ash and calm water. She bowed slightly. Unel returned the gesture. "I've seen your dream," she said softly. "It's ready to be written." He nodded and stepped aside. They sat at the remembering table, a smooth slab of stone and river glass where stories were not recorded in ink but in vibration. Enna laid down a soft square of dream fiber, a living cloth that captured memory not by words but by presence. Unel placed his hands upon it, and without speech the dream unfolded. The long forest path, the endless walk, the moment of stillness, the quiet of the room, the soundless story from the sea. Enna watched it all pass across the cloth, colors blooming and fading, shapes forming, dissolving, returning like a tide of thought. When it ended, she simply pressed the center of the cloth, sealing it. "It is a good dream," she said. "A slow one," Unel replied. She smiled. "The best kind." She stood, bowed again, a bow of closure, and departed as quietly as she had come. Unel returned to his bed. The house dimmed further, now the color of stone warmed by starlight. Outside, the third moon watched with quiet approval. And this time, when Unel closed his eyes, he did not drift. He sank, gently, into a sleep without boundary, a sleep shaped by return, a sleep as all Narodan sleep that did not end with waking, but with the continuation of being. By the time morning once again began its quiet, golden blooming over Naroda, Unel was already awake, not abruptly, not fully, but gently, like a tide pulling back from a shore it had kissed all night. He lay still for a while, watching the changing sky through his small round window. The third moon was fading, not because it had gone, but because it had done its work for now. In Naroda, people didn't say the moon set, they said it returned to its listening. Unel rose without ceremony. He washed his face with the bowl of dew, gathered the soft sandals by his door, and stepped into the fresh breath of a new day. The air was cool, scented faintly with warm stone and sleep blossoms, the flowers that opened only during the night, releasing fragrance to soften dreams. He didn't have a plan. No Narodan did, not until the wind mark arrived. Each day in Naroda began only when the wind passed through the central chime gate, a large archway strung with tones made of wood, glass, and woven memory bells. When the wind came, its music determined the rhythm of the day. Gentle notes meant a day for inner things. Playful tones invited wandering. Deep, resonant ones called for gathering. So Unel walked barefoot to the chime gate along with dozens of others, not in a crowd, but as a quiet river of presence. They stood in silence, all facing the gate, and then a breeze. It came slowly from the sea, weaving through the trees, brushing past rooftops and memory gardens until it reached the chimes. Today's music was low, warm, and round, the kind of sound that moved through the chest and down into the belly. A tone of connection, of shared space and quiet exchange. A circle day. Without a word, the villagers turned and moved toward the gathering terrace, a large stone circle surrounded by sleep trees. No one organized it. No one assigned roles. It simply happened. Some brought cushions. Others brought slow fruit and soft drink. Unel brought only himself, as always. They sat in silence at first. Then one elder began a thread story, not spoken aloud, but hummed in short, soft tones, each one attached to a feeling, passed to the next person in the circle, who added their own hum, their own feeling. Around and around it went. When it reached Unel, he closed his eyes and hummed not a sound of joy or sorrow or hope, but a hum of return. A note that said, "I have been away, and now I am not." The circle paused. Then the next person continued. And so the story of the village grew, not through excitement, not through conflict, but through shared belonging. And above them, the morning sky watched, silent and full, like a page that knew it would be written on with care. As the circle hummed and breathed together, the terrace itself seemed to respond, the stone beneath them warming slightly, as if remembering every gathering that had ever taken place in that space. In Naroda, places were not just spaces, they were participants. They held memory like soil held seeds. The thread story wove itself slowly into silence, not because it ended, but because it had said enough. Narodans knew that endings were not closures, only rests between chapters. No one clapped. No one praised. They simply sat with it, letting the shared hum linger in their chests like the echo of a kind glance. After a while, people began to rise, not all at once, but gently, like mist dispersing as the sun climbs higher. Some returned to their homes, others to the river or the fields. A few stayed, laying on their backs in the grass, letting the sun paint quiet warmth across their faces. Unel remained seated, his hands resting loosely in his lap. Across from him, a child approached, the same one who had given him the listening shell by the shore. She held something new now, a small orb, translucent and softly glowing. She placed it in Unel's palm without a word. He looked at her and she nodded. "This one is not a dream," she said. "It's a pause." Unel understood immediately. In Naroda, pauses were rare gifts, small containers of stillness gathered during deeply present moments. You couldn't create them intentionally. They formed only when life and awareness walked in rhythm. He closed his fingers around it and pressed it to his forehead. The moment passed through him like a breeze through linen, no resistance, only invitation. He felt the circled day, the thread story, the chime gate, the sea, the room of the unfinished dream, all of it folding gently into one still, soft point within him. When he opened his eyes, the child was already walking away, her bare feet brushing over moss-like questions that didn't need answers. Unel stood and walked to the edge of the terrace. From here, he could see the entire village, rooftops glinting like slow-moving stars, people moving with the grace of wind on tall grass, and far in the distance, the shimmer of the sea of listening. He took a deep breath, letting it fill him without rush. And then, not for the first time and not for the last, he whispered the Narodan vow, the one said not aloud but within the body. I will be slower than forgetting, softer than memory, and still enough to feel the world dream. And as he walked away from the terrace, the paws still warm in his hand, the sky shimmered just slightly, not because anything had changed, but because everything had been seen. Later that day, as the golden stillness of the afternoon deepened into shade time, Unel found himself drawn to the House of Remembered Voices, a quiet structure nestled at the foot of the hills, surrounded by soundless bells. They swayed in the breeze but made no noise, their tones held inward, waiting to be released by the right silence. Inside the house, soft alcoves lined the walls. Each held a small object, a cup, a folded scarf, a worn sandal, a stone etched with a line. None were labeled. In Naroda, memory didn't require explanation. You didn't ask whose they were. You simply sat with them, let them speak if they wished. Unel chose an alcove and sat beside a long, curved feather resting on a wooden plate. He placed both hands near it, palms open, and waited. After a long breath, the feather stirred slightly, not from wind, but from presence. A voice bloomed within him, not from outside, not even from the feather, but from the between place, that space Narodans called Elvrin, where memory and imagination are the same thing. The voice said, I once waited so long to be understood, that I became quiet enough to understand myself. Unel let the message settle. He did not interpret it. That was not the Narodan way. He simply wore it for a while, like a shawl made of sky. When he stepped outside, the bells stirred again, and one, just one, rang a soft, clear note. It meant, you are part of this now. The path back home took him through the garden of circular thought, a place where the paths curved endlessly, where no route was straight. Narodans came here when they had questions too large for words. They walked until the shape of the path gave their question a rhythm. Not a solution, just a rhythm. Unel walked. Slowly. He thought not of dreams, nor sleep, nor silence. He thought of presence, of the moment between one step and the next. And as the path curved once more toward his home, he realized, not with his mind, but with his breath, that Naroda was not a place. It was a pace, and he had finally learned to walk it. As twilight began to unfurl its blue-gray softness across the sky, Unel returned home, the realization still quietly blooming within him. Naroda is not a place. It is a pace. His home welcomed him with the familiar warmth of its breathing walls, the scent of ferns steam rising from the corner hearth. The moss floor was cool underfoot, grounding him as the last of the daylight faded from the round windows. He sat in his low chair, not to rest from fatigue, but to merge with the slowing world. This hour, known in Naroda as Syrian, was a sacred time when the day no longer asked anything of you and the night had not yet begun to give. It was the hour of pure stillness. On the table before him lay the small pause orb the child had gifted him earlier. He hadn't used it, not yet. To hold a pause was to hold an entire moment in the palm of your hand, unspoiled by need or narrative. Most Narodans kept them until the right silence opened around them like a flower. And that silence had now arrived. He cupped the orb in both hands and gently brought it to the space just above his heart. The orb responded not with light or sound, but with the slowing of the air itself. The very space around him thickened, like time pausing to listen. And then it happened. A moment, whole and complete, descended upon him. In that moment, he saw the face of Isia, his grandmother, placing leaves in his tea, her hands soft with time. He felt the hush of the room of the unfinished dream wrapping itself around his breath. He remembered the first time he heard the sea of listening speak, not with words, but with warmth. He heard the thread hum from the circle day, the vibration of shared presence. He remembered his own steps, not where they had gone, but how they had moved. He remembered everything that mattered. And when the pause released, gently and slowly, it left behind a kind of sacred silence inside him, not empty, but wide, spacious, kind. The orb faded into dust in his hands, having fulfilled its only purpose, to hold a single, perfect moment. Unel stood and opened his door. Outside, Naroda shimmered with night's approach. Children whispered to their homes. Elders walked slowly beneath lamps that floated without flame. The breeze carried not sound, but memory, the breath of the village itself. And above it all, the third moon rose again, soft, watching, eternal. Unel whispered to it not a question, but a thank you. For slowness, for stillness, for stories that never had to end. That night, as the last of the twilight slipped away like a breath held too long, Unel felt something stir inside him, not urgency, not thought, but a pull. A gentle invitation, as if the stillness itself was asking for his company. He rose, wrapped himself in a shawl woven from sleep silk, and stepped out into the quiet world. Naroda, at night, was not asleep. It was listening. Lanterns floated low, just above the ground, glowing with colors that matched the emotions of the dreamers inside the homes. The air carried the soft scent of moon honey, a rare bloom that opened only when the stars aligned in certain patterns. Tonight, they had. Unel didn't know where he was going. He rarely did. but his feet found the path, not a marked road, but the soft trail, a narrow walk through tall silver grass that shimmered like water in the starlight. It was a path only visible when one moved slowly enough to see it. He walked without thought, letting the night lead. And soon he came to the echo orchard. The trees here were unlike any others, tall, quiet, ancient. Their bark had the texture of memory, and when the wind moved through their branches, it carried echoes from long ago. Not words, not stories, but tones, vibrations of moments that had once mattered. Unel placed his hand on one of the trunks. It responded. A hum moved through his arm, up his neck, behind his eyes. And suddenly he was elsewhere. Not in place, but in feeling. He was a child again, watching his grandmother Iacia stitch a sleeping scarf, her voice humming a tune that had no melody but endless comfort. He was at the sea of listening, hearing it speak his name without sound. He was beneath the third moon, not asking questions, just being held. And then he was back. The tree was still, but something inside him had shifted. He leaned against its trunk and let out a long, soft exhale, the kind of breath that carried seasons inside it. Above, the stars blinked slowly. And somewhere far off, a bell rang once, the tone of a dream beginning. Unel closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to remember more deeply. Because in Naroda, memory wasn't backward. It was inward. Unel remained beneath the echoing tree, his back against its warm, breathing trunk. In Naroda, trees like this were not only old, they were aware. They had listened for so long that they had become part memory, part silence, and part song. Above him, the stars shifted slowly in the sky and never in a hurry, never exactly the same. The threaded constellation curved slightly more eastward, and the third moon lowered just a little, watching not like a sentinel, but like a friend who stayed up to make sure you weren't alone. The hum from the tree faded, but it left something inside Unel, a resonance, a gentle after-feeling that made the world feel wider than before. From the far side of the orchard came a soft light. Not bright, not calling, just present. Unel stood and followed it. It led him to a clearing, one rarely visited, known in Naroda as Soon, or the place between steps. No structures, no lanterns, just open sky and quiet earth. In the center sat a single object, a shallow bowl of still water. Around it, woven mats had been placed in a perfect circle. No one else was there, but the air carried the faintest warmth of recent presence, as if those who had come before him had only just risen and left their memory behind. Unel sat, folded his legs, and looked into the bowl. At first, he saw only his reflection, softened by the stars, blurred by the breeze. But then the water deepened. Not physically, but inwardly. Images emerged, not visions of events, but of states of being. He saw himself walking slower than he ever had. He saw himself saying nothing for an entire day and yet understanding more than he'd learned in years. He saw himself touching the soil not to shape it, but to listen to its temperature. And most deeply, he saw himself as part of Naroda, not as a resident, but as an expression of its rhythm. The bowl pulsed gently as if agreeing. Unel dipped his fingers into the water and whispered, "I accept the pace of this life." And the clearing answered, not with sound, not with wind, but with a deep, wordless yes that moved through the earth like warmth beneath stone. He remained there until the stars began to fade into the first pale light of a new morning. And then he stood, bowed to the bowl, and walked away slowly. The third moon disappeared behind a curtain of soft cloud, and in the east, Naroda began to breathe again, quietly, slowly, completely. As Unel walked back toward the village through the lightning mist, a stillness clung to him, not the silence of absence, but the fullness of presence. Each step pressed gently into the dew-covered moss of the path, and each breath carried the weight of the night he had spent in Vale Soon, the place between steps. By the time he reached the first outer homes of Naroda, the sky had turned the color of warm milk steeped in dreams. The air hummed with the approaching first sounds, not spoken, not played, but lived. A window creaked open to let in the morning. A bird sang one low, lazy note. A pot clinked softly as tea leaves were dropped inside. Unel did not return directly home. Instead, he turned down a narrow path that led to the Stone of Listening, a large, smooth surface half buried in the ground on the edge of the village. It was said that the stone didn't just hear, it remembered how to hear. It had no mouth, no mind, no echo. Just listening. He sat before it as many did and said nothing. He didn't have to. The stone felt what was carried in the chest, not what was carried in the mouth. As the sun crested the low ridge to the east, a beam of warm light fell across Unel's hands. They looked different this morning. Not older, not stronger, just quieter. As if they'd touched something that taught them not just to hold, but to release. And then he heard it, not with his ears, but in the quiet place just behind the heart. You walk like someone who has stopped arriving. It wasn't a voice, not a message. More like a truth brushed gently across the surface of his soul. Unel placed one palm against the stone and exhaled. "I have," he whispered. "I am no longer arriving. I am already here." The stone warmed slightly beneath his touch, its way of acknowledging not just the words, but the being behind them. He stayed until the light had fully broken across the village and the chime gate gave its soft first tone, not the start of something new, but the continuation of what had always been. He rose, bowed once to the stone, and turned toward home. But this time his pace was different. Not slower, not faster, just true. And in Naroda, truth was not measured in facts. It was measured in footsteps that made no noise. As Unel walked the familiar path home, something subtle had shifted, not in the village, not in the air, but in him. The world looked the same, yet it met his gaze differently now, as though it too had been waiting for him to arrive into presence fully and finally. The rooftops of Naroda still shimmered with early dew, the vines still curled lazily around doorways, and the floatlights still drifted slowly near the garden walls, but each of these details now felt closer, as if they, too, had exhaled. He passed the baker's window where soft morning bread was being arranged on a wide stone plate. No one reached for the bread. In Naroda, the first loaves were meant only to be smelled. Their warmth was a gift of presence, not of hunger. The act of breathing them in was called early receiving. Unel stopped for a moment, inhaled the scent deeply, and bowed his head. At his doorstep, his house greeted him with a quiet pulse of warmth. It had missed him, not with longing, but with holding. The walls did not speak, but they seemed to lean in slightly, as if to say, "You are exactly as you should be, no more, no less." He entered and placed his shawl gently on its hook, a curved piece of driftwood shaped like a sleeping question mark. He poured himself a small bowl of leaf silence, a kind of morning drink brewed from soaked petals that carried no flavor, only calm. He sipped slowly, watching the light shift on the floor. Then he heard it. A quiet knock, not from urgency, but from intention. At the door stood three people, an elder, a child, and someone wearing a robe of in-between color, the dream weaver, a role given not to a storyteller, but to one who gathered the unseen threads between stories. They said nothing. They only nodded. Unel understood. Today was a carrying day. Once every season, selected villagers would carry a memory, not their own, to a distant tree known as the Hollow Witness, where the memory could rest, breathe, and root itself in the silence of the living world. The elder held a bundle wrapped in sleep-colored cloth. The child carried a small bell, its clapper removed. It rang only when truly forgotten things passed nearby. The dream weaver carried nothing visible. Unel joined them without question. No words, only presence. And together they began to walk out of the village. Through the silver grass, beyond the known curves of Naroda, toward that quiet place where memory, silence, and story all sat side by side. Not to deliver something, but to carry it gently enough that it would know it mattered. The four of them walked in silence. Unel, the elder, the child, and the dream weaver, moving like breath through the long folds of the land. Beyond the village, Naroda widened into quiet wilderness. Low hills like folded blankets, patches of whispering moss, and trees that leaned slightly inward, as if eavesdropping on time itself. The path they followed was not marked. In fact, it wasn't a path at all. Only a shared memory of direction, passed from walker to walker, like a song hummed in the chest. The child occasionally lifted the bell, the one without a clapper, holding it up as if to test the stillness around them. It never rang, but every time she raised it, the air became even more silent, like a hush inside a hush. The dream weaver smiled gently each time, nodding as if to say, "Yes, This is what we are here for. Unel carried nothing in his hands, but within him something old and quiet stirred, a kind of listening that had no beginning, no end. He was becoming, in the Narodan sense, a vessel not of thought, not of message, but of meaning held lightly. After some time, or perhaps no time at all, they reached the place. The hollow witness stood alone in a wide clearing, its bark as pale as cloud bone, its trunk wider than 3 people could wrap their arms around. Its branches reached low, invitingly, as if to say, I do not stand above you. I stand with you. And in the center of the tree's base was a hollow, smooth, round, just large enough to receive something precious. The elder stepped forward first. She bowed, deeply, slowly, her body moving like an old echo returning to its source. She placed the sleep-colored bundle gently into the hollow. Her hands lingered, not to hold, but to bless with patience. Then the child approached. She held the silent bell to the opening. For the first time, it gave off a faint shimmer of sound. Not a chime, but a memory exhaling. It was enough. Finally, the dream weaver laid her hand on the tree, and the air around them softened, folding inward like a breath being taken by the world itself. Unel stepped forward last. He said nothing. He simply pressed his open palm against the smooth surface of the bark, and in that moment, every dream, every pause, every step he had taken since his return settled into quiet, into ground, into belonging. They stood there for a while, not watching, not waiting, just being present as the tree accepted the memory, absorbed it, transformed it into something root-bound and living. When it was done, the tree released a faint warmth into the clearing. It meant, carried. The 4 turned and began the journey back, lighter, not from what they had given, but from how gently they had held it. And behind them the hollow witness stood, not as a monument, but as a reminder that nothing carried with care is ever truly gone. Their return to the village was as quiet as their departure. In Naroda, the way back was just as sacred as the way there. Nothing was ever finished, only softened, folded, and set down gently for the world to keep. The light had shifted by the time they reached the edge of the village, now touched with the pale gold of second breath, the part of day when everything seems to pause, as if even the sun needed to exhale before moving on. Villagers didn't rush to greet them. No questions were asked. Those who noticed simply placed their palms over their chests, a silent gesture of respect for what had been carried, and for how it had been carried. The elder gave a soft nod to Unel, then walked away with the slow, round steps of someone who had just returned a memory to where it belonged. The child lingered a moment longer. She placed the silent bell into Unel's hands and looked at him with the kind of still gaze that asked nothing and gave everything. "You'll know when to use it," she said simply, and then skipped off, her small feet barely touching the moss. Unel held the bell, its smooth shape light and cool in his hands. Though it had no clapper, it seemed to hum ever so slightly when he breathed near it, as though it recognized him now and was ready to speak only when the world truly stilled. Back at home, the door opened with the faint scent of candle fruit and aged bark. His house had warmed itself slightly, sensing that his steps were softer than usual. It knew something had settled in him, something had rooted. He placed the bell on a small ledge near the window, where it caught the last of the afternoon light. Then he sat and did nothing, not as avoidance, but as offering, because in Naroda doing nothing was a way of giving space, for the wind to pass, for a thought to arrive, for the self to open. And as Unel sat in the silence of his home, something inside him whispered, not in words, but in rhythm, "You are no longer carrying what was. You are ready now to listen for what will come." And outside, the third moon began its slow rise once more, pale and faithful, because some stories never end. They just continue at the pace of Naroda. It began, as many things in Naroda did, not with a sound, but with a pause. Several days had passed since Unel helped carry the memory to the hollow witness. The village had returned to its soft rhythms. The slow tending of leaf paths, the shaping of cloud bread, the telling of stories by sitting beside someone in silence. But something subtle, gentle, yet undeniable had changed. The third moon began rising earlier, and it lingered longer. Narodans noticed this not with surprise, but with attention. In their world, the moons were not just celestial bodies. They were teachers of rhythm. And when one changed its behavior, it was not an omen. It was an invitation. Unel, now accustomed to listening deeper than thought, felt the shift like a breeze beneath the skin. He began waking just before the third moon rose, sitting by his window, sipping warm root water, and simply watching. The moon didn't grow brighter, but it grew quieter, so quiet that its silence began to shape dreams. Villagers spoke, carefully, briefly, of dreams with a new quality. Not voices, not visions, but spaces. Dreams of rooms that had no walls, of time that did not pass, of feelings that had no names but stayed in the chest like a warm stone. And one morning, As Unel traced the dew on his window with a single fingertip, his house exhaled. Literally, it breathed out a soft mist from the walls, a sign known only to a few. It is time to seek the forgotten listening. He did not hesitate. He packed lightly, a shawl, a slice of cloud bread, the silent bell, and began walking, not away from Naroda, but deeper into it, into the parts not drawn on maps, into the folds of the land where paths had stopped being remembered, not because they were lost, but because some things must be re-listened to, not refound. And as he crossed the boundary between the known and the not yet known, Unel whispered to the sky, just as the third moon dipped behind a veil of morning mist, "I am ready to listen to what we forgot to remember." Unel walked into the mist of unremembered paths, the kind of space in Naroda where even silence went deeper. These were not the forbidden lands, for Naroda had no such concept. They were the unspoken lands, places where meaning lived before it learned to take form. The ground beneath his feet was soft and pulsing, like breathing moss. Trees here grew wider, lower, bending gently toward him, not as guardians but as witnesses. Their bark shimmered faintly, as if they were wrapped in half-memories. The further Unel walked, the quieter it became. And then he heard it, not a sound, a pull, like a pause unfolding from inside his chest. He stopped. Before him stood something ancient, not a structure, not a shrine. It was a listening fold, a place where space itself curved inward to hold something forgotten. Only a few had ever reached it, and fewer still had understood it was there. It looked like a dip in the earth, a gentle, concave slope, ringed with slow-moving air. At its center, a smooth stone circle, no taller than his knee, and completely still. So still, in fact, it made the rest of the world seem loud in comparison. Unel stepped forward and placed the silent bell on the edge of the fold. He sat, and he listened, not with ears, not with thoughts, but with stillness. For a long time, or no time at all, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a sound began to shape itself inside him. Not words, not meaning, just presence, like the memory of having been heard by someone who never spoke. And then came a feeling like a voice being remembered just before it disappears. You forgot this kind of listening. The one that hears what isn't being said. The moment unfolded like a petal warmed by breath. Unel felt tears rise, not from sorrow, but from recognition, from the ache of reunion with something that had once lived inside him. The listening fold had not told him anything. It had only made space, and now that space was open again. He lay down on the stone, curled gently and whispered, "I remember what I didn't know I had lost." Above him, the third moon was faint, but it lingered in the daylight sky, watching still. And somewhere, far back in the village of Naroda, the wind carried the soft tone of the bell he had left behind. And for those who heard it, it said only one thing: begin listening differently. Unel remained in the listening fold long after the light had shifted, long after the air had cooled and taken on that soft sharpness that precedes evening in Naroda. But he did not feel cold. The stillness itself had become a kind of warmth, not of heat, but of knowing presence. And for a while, that was all he needed. Eventually he rose. He did not take the bell. It had become part of the fold now, and in Naroda, when an object found its place, it stayed. To move it would be to forget the lesson it had just begun to teach. Instead, Unel walked away from the fold with lighter steps, not because he had left something behind, but because something heavy inside him had turned into listening. As he walked, the landscape responded gently, subtly. The moss softened further beneath his feet, the trees leaned inward not as warning, but as welcome. Even the air began to carry a timbre he hadn't noticed before, a low tone that wasn't music, but agreement. He was heading toward the weaver's silence, a place spoken of rarely in Naroda, not because it was secret, but because it asked not to be spoken of. The path there could not be followed. It had to be felt. Each time Unel paused to listen, the way became a little clearer. A curve in the land here, a warm stone there, a flicker of shadow passing in just the right shape to nudge him forward. And then, just as the third moon began to lift its pale eye above the horizon, before sunset, earlier than usual, he arrived. A small hollow in the land, covered in threads, not like cloth, but like thoughts spun from air, hanging between branches and posts, swaying so gently they seemed woven from light itself. Here, the weavers of silence worked. They did not speak. They did not look up. Their hands moved slowly with complete attention. They were weaving not garments, but moments. Threads of memory, threads of stillness, threads of things left unsaid. Unel bowed and sat on the edge of the hollow. He did not ask to join. One did not ask. If one was meant to weave, the silence would let them know. He waited. The wind passed through the threads, and one of them shimmered near his cheek, a light touch like the echo of a forgotten kindness. And just like that, Unel understood. He had not come here to weave with his hands. He had come to offer a silence of his own. So he closed his eyes, and he sat, and for the rest of the night, the threads of silence shimmered gently around him, weaving his presence into something larger, slower, and more necessary than sound. By the time dawn brushed its first light across the threads of the hollow, Unel had become indistinguishable from the stillness around him. Not because he had disappeared, but because he had settled so completely into presence that the world no longer needed to notice him to feel him. The weavers of silence were still moving, their hands performing slow, looping gestures through the hanging threads. But now something was different. The threads they wove near Unel shimmered in a deeper tone, not visually but emotionally, a shade known in Naroda as Valen, meaning the silence that has been seen. And then, without a word, one of the weavers, an elder with palms as lined as riverbeds, turned to him. She held out a single thread. It was nearly invisible, like frost thought on glass. Unel took it. He did not ask what it was for. In Naroda, if something was placed in your hand, it meant only one thing. There is something still waiting for your silence. So he stood, bowed in the shape of a listening arc, and stepped out of the hollow. The thread fluttered gently behind him, as though not tied to his fingers, but to his willingness. The path back was not the same as the one he had followed. It never was. The land shifted subtly around him, rearranging to match his new rhythm. Stones tilted differently. The grass now leaned toward him. Trees whispered less. Not because they had gone quiet, but because they sensed he no longer needed reassurance. And then, just before reaching the edge of the village, Unel heard something. Not with ears, with the thread. It tightened slightly in his hand. Ahead was a small clearing, one that had always been there, yet he had never seen. In its center was a listening chair, a seat carved not for comfort, but for openness. It was said that these chairs, placed in hidden spaces across Naroda, could hold stories that had not yet been spoken, but were ready to become real. Unel sat. He waited. The thread shimmered across his lap. And then a voice, not from around him, not from within him, but from between. There is a story that has not been born, because it has never been listened to long enough to know it exists. The thread pulsed gently, and Unel once again did not speak. He simply listened, not for sound, but for becoming, and slowly the air around him began to shape itself into feeling, into memory, into a beginning of a story not his, but one that had waited patiently for someone to sit and make a space for it to arrive. The story arrived slowly, not in words, not in pictures, but in texture. Unel sat motionless in the listening chair as the world around him began to shift, not physically, but emotionally. The air thickened with intention. The trees no longer rustled. The wind no longer moved. Even the birds had quieted. Everything had stepped back to make room for the emergence. And then it came. First, a sensation, like the weight of rain that never falls. Heavy, expectant, gentle. Then a warmth. Not on the skin, but beneath it, as though something ancient was rising through his bones. not memory, not knowledge, but recognition. And then the first fragment of story. There was once a village that lived in the future. So far in the future, they forgot how to arrive. Unel felt his breath catch. The thread pulsed in his fingers, pulling slightly, like a quiet voice saying yes. They built towers not to live in, but to see what was next. They asked questions not to learn, but to control. And when dreams came, they captured them in glass. The voice paused not for drama, but for space. The kind of pause that asked, "Are you still with me?" Unel nodded, though no one watched. The story continued. One day, a child was born who didn't look forward. She looked inward, and when asked what she saw, she said, "I see what is already here, but hasn't been welcomed yet." At that moment, the thread tightened once more, and then it did something unexpected. It broke. Not from force, not from flaw, but from completion. Unel looked down. The broken thread lay in his lap, glowing faintly, its purpose fulfilled. It had brought him the story, a story not his, but one he had made space for. And now it would live, not in books, not in memory, but in the shape of his silence. He rose from the listening chair, bowed, and left the clearing with empty hands and a full stillness, for in Naroda there is no greater gift than to carry something that was never yours and let it go when it is finally ready to belong to the world. As Unel stepped away from the listening chair and back into the dappled light of Naroda's hidden paths, he felt as though the very landscape had exhaled. The story that had come to him, so soft, so long forgotten, so nearly lost, had now been received. And that reception was enough to change something subtle in the soil, in the rhythm of leaves, even in the distant pulse of the third moon. He walked with empty hands, but not with absence. In Naroda, emptiness was a kind of fullness, not the lack of weight, but the presence of space. As he approached the village, the first tones of evening cooling floated through the air. Bells played not by fingers, but by wind passing through woven glass shells. These tones were not meant to guide time, but to reflect it, a gentle acknowledgement that this moment is passing, and it is beautiful for that reason alone. At the edge of the village stood a quiet platform, the echo table. People came here to place what could not be explained, thoughts without words, feelings without shape, memories without stories. The table, made of moonwood and listening clay, absorbed them gently. Unel approached it, placed his hands palm down on its cool surface, and closed his eyes. He didn't try to share what had just happened. He didn't need to. The table wasn't there to receive stories. It was there to receive readiness. And in that moment, Unel was ready. To do what? Even he didn't know. But the table did. It pulsed once beneath his hands. A slow, steady rhythm, like a heart that had just remembered how to rest. And then, from the center of the table, a small ripple appeared, not of water, but of possibility. A faint circle of soft blue light expanding outward. Not a message, not a sign, a welcome. He stepped back, bowed once, and walked home through streets that glowed not from lanterns, but from the presence of lives lived attentively. He entered his house. The walls adjusted their tone to match the pace of his breath. The floor warmed. A cup of quiet leaf tea brewed itself by timing, not temperature. And as he sat, sipping slowly, looking out at the third moon rising again for the 1,000th time, Unel whispered, not to himself, not to the world, but to the space between. I am ready to carry the next silence. And in the hush that followed, even the moon seemed to nod. That night, Unel slept as Narodans often did after a deep listening, not into sleep, but with it, like two rivers folding into each other. His home, sensing his rest, dimmed its walls to the shade of Harnel, the color of remembered peace. Outside, the third moon hovered low and close, casting a glow so soft that even the shadows looked as if they were sleeping. And in his dreams, there were no stories, just space, warm breathing space, until, slowly, a single door appeared. It stood in the middle of nothing, not darkness, not light, just calm. The door was old, Narodan crafted. Its wood curved slightly, not out of warping, but out of memory, as if the door had been opened and closed so many times it had learned to lean with expectation. Unel approached it. He didn't knock. He stood with it, and the door opened on its own. Behind it was not a room, not a place. It was a question, one that pulsed slowly like the rhythm of Naroda itself. What does your silence know? That your voice has not yet dared to say. Unel stood inside the threshold of that question. He didn't answer. He simply listened. And in doing so, the dream shifted, not ending, not fading, but becoming clear. He awoke just before dawn. The house greeted him with warmth along the floorboards. A soft drink of memory root awaited him in the stone cup. He took it slowly, letting the dream linger in his body like light through old fabric. Today would not be like others. Today he would walk to the place of first sound, a sacred Narodan site visited only when one was ready to let silence give way to voice. Not speaking, not storytelling, but the first sound after deep listening, the tone of a truth that had lived long in quiet. He packed nothing. Only himself, and before leaving, he whispered to the cup, my silence has ripened, and the cup, warmed by dream, released a final wisp of steam, shaped like a question that had finally found someone willing to hear it. The walk to the place of first sound was not long, but it was slow. Not because of distance, but because of weight, not burden, but meaning. In Naroda, one did not walk towards such a place with haste, for the ground itself would resist. Not by force, but by rhythm. The path wound gently through soft hills and dusk-leaf trees whose branches moved not with wind, but with breath, the breath of those who passed before and the breath of the silence still settling inside. As Unel walked, the world around him adjusted. Birds paused their morning calls, even water in nearby streams slowed its flow to match his steps. Somewhere behind him, a listening bell gave off a single soft tone, the kind that marked alignment rather than arrival. The place of first sound could not be seen from a distance. It revealed itself only when you were ready to hear what you already knew. And then, at a bend in the trail, it appeared, a round clearing. At its center, a stone bowl, perfectly still, half filled with water from rains no one remembered. Surrounding it were 3 voice stones, not to sit on, but to stand before. Each was carved with a single glyph. Not yet. Now. No longer. Unel stepped into the circle. The moment he crossed the threshold, his body responded. His breath deepened. His shoulders softened. His chest felt warm. He approached the second stone, now, and stood still. In Naroda, to stand before the now stone was to accept that silence had given all it could and that it was time for voice, not loud, not long, but true. He placed his hand on the stone, waited, and then from his chest, not throat, a sound emerged. Not a word, not a note, a tone. It vibrated through him like a thread being pulled free from a tight weave. The tone said, "I am not trying to understand. I am trying to become what is already true." And the stone warmed beneath his hand. The bowl of water in the center shimmered once, and then stillness again. But this time a different stillness. Not the silence of waiting. The silence of having spoken what needed to be said. Without saying too much, Unel bowed to the bowl, to the stones, to the air. And as he turned to walk back, the world around him whispered, "Now you may begin." Unel left the place of first sound in silence, but not the silence of holding in or not knowing what to say. It was the silence after, the kind that follows a truth gently released into the world. The trail back to the village was the same and yet entirely different. Trees that once leaned in to listen now swayed aside, not turning away, but creating space. He moved through the space with the care of someone carrying something sacred, even though his hands were empty. Because in Naroda, after you speak your first sound, you are not carrying the sound itself. You are carrying its echo. And that echo doesn't belong to you. It belongs to those who will need it later. As he re-entered the village, a few neighbors lifted their gaze, not to greet, not to ask, but in quiet acknowledgement. They could hear it in him. The soft shift in presence. The after sound. The weight of something spoken that had left him lighter. He walked past the stone garden, the float light fountain, the sleeping chair square. Finally, he returned to his home. And there, waiting for him not as a surprise, but as a recognition, was a voice cloth hanging from his doorway. Voice cloths were rare in Naroda. They were woven not by hand, but by the weavers of listening, and only gifted to someone who had spoken a sound the world had long been waiting to hear. Unel touched it. The cloth shifted in color, not reacting, but responding. It turned a soft tone known as violin, the hue of a message that has landed. He brought it inside and placed it beside his sleeping space. Not to admire, not to protect, but to live with, for it would now listen with him. He sat, breathed once, and then, as the third moon lifted again into the violet dusk, Unel whispered not to himself, not to the cloth, not even to the world. He whispered to the next silence, "I am ready to listen from where I have spoken." And somewhere beyond the garden paths, a child stopped, turned her head slightly, and smiled. Not because she heard the words, but because she felt the shape of them pass by, like the warmth left in the air after a story has been told gently enough to stay. That evening, as the last threads of daylight slipped behind the hills, Unel sat quietly beside the voice cloth, letting his body remember the tone he had released at the place of first sound. He did not rehearse it. He did not repeat it. In Naroda, a true sound was never echoed by the one who spoke it. Its echo lived in others, passed not by intention, but by resonance. The voice cloth responded to his silence with a faint shimmer, not of color this time, but of warmth, a pulse felt only in the skin when the breath slows and the heart opens without trying. And then came a sound from outside, not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable. A knock. In Naroda, a knock at night meant only one thing. Someone is bringing you a silence they cannot yet carry alone. Unel rose and opened the door. There stood a young woman, eyes tired, shoulders drawn inward, her hands wrapped around nothing. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Unel stepped aside. She entered, moved slowly, and sat across from the voice cloth. Her presence filled the room like smoke, soft, slow, and searching. After a long while, she spoke. "I have a silence that's grown too wide for my chest." Unel nodded. He reached for a second cup, poured warm memory root water, and handed it to her with both hands. She held it, did not drink, just held. The voice cloth rippled once, catching a thread of her silence. Then again softer, aligning with the shape of what had not yet been said. And then gently she began to unfold, not in confessions, not in stories, but in pauses. One by one, she offered her unsaid thoughts into the space between them. And Unel, still echoing his own sound, listened without holding. He let her silence land, not to keep, but to make room. By the time her cup had cooled, She had spoken nothing that would be remembered by the mind, only by the room, only by the thread, only by the cloth. She placed the cup down, bowed her head, and stood. "I can carry it again now," she whispered. Unel smiled, a Narodan smile, full of space, never of conclusion. She left without another word, and Unel remained, not thinking, not processing, just sitting with a silence that had been shared and had chosen not to stay. That night, the air in Unel's home felt wider, not emptier, not quieter, just more capable of holding. The kind of air that had been trusted with something weighty and had carried it well. The voice cloth hung still, but alive, like a string of mist caught between stories. It did not glow, it did not hum, but Unel could feel it remembering the silence it had helped receive. He sat for a while without movement, no candle lit, no tea warmed, only stillness. And then, as the third moon crested low and near, brushing the tops of listening trees with its quiet light, Unel stood. He stepped outside. The village was nearly asleep, not in darkness, but in glow silence. The ambient hush that happened only on nights when something had shifted deeply within the village as a whole. And he realized he wasn't the only one who had spoken a first sound. Somewhere others had as well. Not at the same time, not in the same way, but the tone had spread like warmth through stone. And now Naroda was listening differently. He walked slowly, letting his feet find a rhythm he didn't try to control. He passed the sleep gardens, where vines curled over resting benches. He passed the moss library, where thoughts not yet turned into language were left to grow. Finally, he reached the threshold tree, an old, hollowed trunk on the edge of the village. It marked the line between shared space and what lies beyond knowing. He placed his hand upon it, waited. The bark pulsed once, recognition, and from deep inside the hollow, a voice not made of sound stirred. "You have carried silence. You have given it breath. Now you must follow where it begins to speak." Unel bowed low, not in obedience, in trust. He would not go tonight, but soon. The path beyond the threshold tree was not for feet alone. It was for those who had learned that listening is not the absence of noise, but the presence of readiness. He returned home before sunrise, placed both hands gently on the voice cloth, and said only, "I will go when the silence tells me to." The cloth shifted once in the dark, and the house, wrapped in night, nodded. The following days in Naroda unfolded with the kind of stillness that often arrives before movement returns. It was the kind of stillness that doesn't stop life, but deepens it, where every gesture carries more intention, every pause becomes part of the conversation. Unel remained in the village, but he was no longer of it in the way he had been before. Not distant, not above, just aligned to something larger than village rhythm. Something just beginning to rise beneath the surface of the known. He did simple things. He gathered water moss for the elders. He helped a child learn how to walk a listening path without stepping too loudly. He sat beside the moss of the garden wall, tracing spirals with his finger, not for meaning, but for memory. And then one morning, the threshold tree bloomed. It happened once every few generations. The tree, which had long stood still, opened a cluster of pale, pulsing leaves from within its hollow. These leaves didn't offer shade or scent. They offered invitation. 3 of them. Unel, upon hearing the whispers of the blooming, walked to the tree. 2 others were already there. One was the young woman who had come to him with her silence not long ago. She carried now a small bundle of dreamcloth, the kind used to wrap thoughts that don't want to be spoken yet. The other was an elder Unel had never seen before, though something about him felt inevitably familiar. He held no object. Only a single tone hummed faintly from his chest, as if his body carried an instrument that had never needed to be tuned. Together they approached the leaves, and the leaves began to dim, not in light but in intensity, a sign that the invitation had been heard and accepted. The path beyond the tree unrolled like a ribbon of soft stone, barely visible. It was not a trail. It was a tuning. Unel stepped onto the path of the long listening, joined by the woman with the dreamcloth and the elder whose breath seemed to sing without sound. The 3 walked not in formation, not with destination, but in rhythm, like a single phrase unfolding in 3 voices. The trail beyond the threshold tree was unlike any place in Naroda proper. It wasn't wilder, or stranger, or darker. It was simply less named. Here stones had no memory of footsteps. Here trees did not lean to listen. They listened only inward, curling into themselves like deep thoughts. Even the air felt newly born, still deciding whether it should be warm or cool, dense or light. This place was known to Narodans not as wilderness, but as field tone, a term for the inner edge of the known world, where sound has not yet become language. As they walked, the woman occasionally touched her dreamcloth, whispering to it not words, but shapes, curving sounds shaped by breath and meaning that hadn't yet found form. The elder hummed low tones at intervals, as if helping the space find its center. His hums never changed pitch, but with every one, the air shifted slightly, as though the world responded with small realignments. Unel walked between them, and within him the memory of his first tone from the place of first sound pulsed softly, not repeating, but echoing in deeper chambers of his being. They did not speak, not for hours, not even with glances, but when the sun had dipped low enough that the sky turned the color of early velvet, the three came upon a clearing. In the center, a stone table partially buried in the earth, round, with three shallow impressions carved into its surface. Each impression glowed faintly, not from light, but from waiting. The elder stepped forward first and placed both palms in one of the hollows. His hum deepened. The tone from his chest passed through the stone and into the ground. The clearing responded with a wind that didn't move, but sounded like it could. The woman followed. She placed her dream cloth in the second hollow. It unraveled not into threads, but into memory vapors, small wisps of stories not yet lived, slowly rising into the dusk. Then Unel stepped forward. He had nothing in his hands, but he knew what to do. He leaned over the third hollow, and he exhaled. That was all. But the breath he released carried everything. The tone from the place of first sound, the echo of the listening chair, the silence of the girl with the too wide silence, the warmth of the voice cloth, and the hum of walking deeper than memory. The stone did not glow. It simply stopped waiting. And that in Naroda was how you knew something had been received. The three stood in silence around the table as the third moon rose, closer than ever before, as if it too had come to listen. And in that stillness, something new began. Not a story, not a task, but a field of listening so vast, it would take many silences to walk its full width. The beginning of what Narodans called the long listening, a journey where nothing is asked, and yet everything is heard. Unel turned once to look back at the village, not with sadness, not with finality, but with a smile full of space. The voice cloth still hung in his window, fluttered once, and then fell still, not because it was done, but because he was now carrying what it once held. As the third moon settled above the horizon, not in the sky, but within it, like a quiet thought cradled behind the stars, the clearing held a stillness that even Narodans rarely knew. The stone table had accepted what had been brought. The impressions dimmed slowly, not fading but sealing, like the breath after a word that no longer needs to be repeated. The elder stepped back and bowed low, his hum falling silent for the first time since their journey began. But the silence that followed didn't feel like absence, felt like rest. His chest no longer vibrated with sound. Now it vibrated with presence. The woman stood with her dream cloth, now fully dissolved. Only a soft shimmer of unlived story hovered in her hands, like mist cupped gently. She whispered one final shape into it, a spiral, and then let it go. It rose, not into the air, but into possibility. Unel watched them both, but more than that, he heard them. Not their words, not their thoughts, but their integration. He had become quiet enough to hear what most people only feel, the sound of someone having become more whole. And now it was his turn. The table no longer called. The moment had passed, but the field beyond, wide, unnamed, listening, opened before them. This was the entrance to what Narodans called the Great Tone. Not a place, not an event, but a long, unfolding stretch of world where every thought, breath, and step was echoed back not as a mirror, but as a question. Is this who you truly are, or just who you have remembered being? To walk the Great Tone was not to seek something. It was to be asked, again and again, by the silence itself. Are you still becoming softer? Are you still becoming slower? Are you still becoming true? The three began walking. No leader, no destination, only the rhythm of listening woven between their footsteps. They passed trees that did not grow leaves but tones. Each leaf curled into a soft note, falling to the ground in patterns that shifted with the listener's breath. They passed a stream that didn't flow, but waited, its surface reflecting not light, but recent thoughts. And finally, they came upon a place that had no name, only a circle of hollow stones arranged in a gentle spiral. In the center, a seat not meant for sitting, only for being near. Unel stepped close, and the air around him whispered, in a tone lower than sound, but clearer than memory. This is where those who have carried silence, long enough for it to grow roots, learn how to speak as silence itself. He knelt beside the seat and said nothing, which in this place was the beginning of the most powerful voice of all.